In 1967, something happened in the United States that should have torn apart the comforting story of equal rights. Instead, it was pushed aside, misrepresented, and slowly faded from mainstream memory. 30 black men walked into California's state capitol with loaded rifles, not sneaking, not after dark, not breaking laws. They entered in broad daylight with cameras pointed at them, reporters watching, and lawmakers stunned into silence. Every gun was legally owned. Every move they made was lawful. Every step was protected under the Constitution of the United States. And yet, within weeks, one of the most powerful state governments on earth raced to rewrite the rules. Not because anyone was hurt, not because shots were fired, not because a crime happened. It moved because black Americans had committed what the system treated as an unforgivable act. They used the Second Amendment the same way white Americans had been allowed to use it for generations. And the system panicked. This isn't really a story about firearms. It's a story about power and fear and about who the Constitution has been allowed to protect in practice. Because when armed white militias formed during the country's earliest days, they were celebrated as defenders and patriots. When armed white men hunted enslaved Africans, crushed uprisings, and terrorized black voters during Reconstruction, they were often labeled law enforcement or citizen groups. When armed white crowds marched through towns, courthouses, and Capitol buildings, it was framed as freedom in action. But when black people carried guns to defend their own lives, America suddenly discovered the danger of weapons. To understand why armed black citizens terrified the United States, you have to understand Oakland in the 1960s. After World War II, tens of thousands of black families left the Jim Crow South. They were fleeing lynchings, forced labor, chain gangs, and a legal system that treated black existence as tolerable only when it served white economic needs. They were chasing what their parents and grandparents had been denied across generations: safety, opportunity, dignity. Oakland, like many northern and western cities, promised a fresh start: defense industry work, union paychecks, the possibility of building wealth, the chance to raise children without living under constant threat. But many black families did not find freedom. They found occupation. The Oakland Police Department did not behave like a service for black neighborhoods. It operated like a controlling force. Officers moved through black communities like they were patrolling enemy ground. Sirens didn't mean help was coming. They meant danger was close. A traffic stop could turn into a beating. A question could become handcuffs. A misunderstanding could become a funeral. By the mid-1960s, Oakland police were killing one black person roughly every 3 weeks. There were no meaningful trials, no real accountability, no consequences that matched the severity of what was happening. Courts did nothing. Much of the press played it down. Politicians avoided the issue, and the message landed with brutal clarity: your rights exist on paper, not in the street. 2 young men watched this cycle repeat again and again: Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale. They were college students. They read constantly. They were politically sharp, deeply angry, and painfully aware that pleading for mercy had never protected black people. Marches didn't stop bullets. Speeches didn't stop batons. Prayers didn't stop officers from killing unarmed black people. They weren't looking for symbolic protest. They were looking for survival. So they didn't start with slogans. They started with law. They studied statutes line by line, penal codes, case law, constitutional interpretation. They searched for something the system couldn't easily twist into a charge or an excuse, and eventually they found it. At the time, California law permitted open carry. A citizen could legally carry a loaded firearm in public as long as it was visible and not used in a threatening way. This wasn't some hidden trick. White Americans had relied on that kind of legal protection for generations, and it had been used for intimidation, for terror, for enforcing white supremacy with little consequence. Newton and Seale saw the contradiction and turned it into a strategy. If white men could carry guns to dominate, then black men could carry guns to defend. In October 1966, the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense was formed, not as a street gang, not as criminals, but as a disciplined response to state violence shaped by legal knowledge and a clear political purpose. They laid out a 10-point program, demands that only sounded radical because America had spent centuries refusing black people the basics: decent jobs, fair housing, education, health care, and an end to police brutality and killing without consequence. But the most revolutionary part wasn't the list. It was what they did next. The Panthers began to follow police cars. When officers stopped black residents, Panthers would arrive. They kept a legal distance. They stepped out calmly. Rifles and shotguns were visible, and in their hands, they carried law books. They didn't scream. They didn't interfere. They didn't threaten. They watched. And when police tried to challenge them, Panthers responded with the law, quoting California codes word for word, explaining precisely why their presence and their weapons were legal. They called it policing the police, and it changed the streets. For the first time, officers couldn't brutalize people without witnesses. They couldn't invent stories behind closed doors as easily. They couldn't depend on fear and silence to control every encounter. Violence dropped. The community noticed. The story spread. Within months, the Black Panther Party grew from a small circle into hundreds. Black Oakland felt something it had rarely been allowed to feel: protection. But white Oakland felt something else: panic. Because a comfortable national lie was collapsing. The issue was no longer whether black people had rights on paper. The real question was now unavoidable. Would the system tolerate black people defending those rights with force? The answer arrived quickly. In early 1967, California Assemblyman Don Mulford, a conservative lawmaker from Oakland, introduced a bill. On the surface, it sounded neutral. Technical language, reasonable framing. The kind of proposal politicians love because it hides intent behind procedure. It would ban the open carry of loaded firearms in public. No racial wording, no direct mention of the Panthers. But everyone understood exactly who the target was. The law wasn't written because open carry was newly dangerous. It was written because the wrong people were using it effectively. And as the bill moved forward at speed, the Panthers recognized the familiar pattern. Whenever black people discovered a legal way to protect themselves, the system rewrote the law. They faced a choice: stay quiet and watch the shield disappear, or force the country to face the truth in public. They chose confrontation, and they chose it where no one could look away: the California state capitol in Sacramento. They understood the timeline was closing. If the Mulford bill became law, the one tool that had forced police restraint would vanish overnight. And history had taught them what came next. Once black communities were disarmed, the violence returned, quietly, routinely, with official denials and public indifference. So the Panthers didn't debate whether the system would be fair. They already knew it wouldn't. The only question was how to make the injustice impossible to hide. They had watched this pattern stretch back for generations. Whenever black people found a lawful way to protect themselves or claim power, the rules shifted. Voting became qualified through literacy tests and poll taxes. Movement became criminalized through vagrancy laws. Survival became suspect through selective enforcement. The method changed, the purpose didn't. Bobby Seale and the leadership made a decision that was both strategic and symbolic. If lawmakers wanted to disarm them in the name of public safety, then the world would see exactly what public safety meant when black citizens exercised constitutional rights. On May 2, 1967, 30 members of the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense arrived in Sacramento. They came as men and women, young, disciplined, and deliberate. They wore black berets and black leather jackets, not as costume, but as uniform. A visible statement that this was organized, not chaotic, and they were armed, rifles, shotguns, pistols, all legally owned, all legally carried. They walked up the steps of the California State Capitol and entered the building. No one stopped them, not because officials approved, but because the law offered no clear grounds to prevent it. Security guards froze, caught between instinct and legality. Lawmakers stared, trapped in the uncomfortable reality that the rules they defended for white citizens now applied to black citizens too. Reporters rushed, cameras snapped, conversations died mid-sentence. The Panthers moved through marble corridors with controlled calm. No shouting, no threats, no shots. Not a single round fired. They didn't come to attack the government. They came to reveal it. They made their way toward the assembly chamber where the very bill designed to strip them of their legal protection was moving forward. And outside, on the Capitol steps, Bobby Seale faced the cameras and read a prepared statement. His words weren't vague. They weren't polite. They weren't softened for approval. He warned that black people and the American public at large should pay close attention to a legislature preparing to keep black communities disarmed and powerless. That was the center of it, a direct accusation spoken openly with rifles visible behind him. Then the images hit the country. Armed black men inside a state capitol. For millions of Americans, it felt shocking, not because it was illegal, but because it shattered an expectation that had been treated as natural. That power and the right to enforce it belonged in white hands. The reaction was immediate. Newspapers ran dramatic headlines. Politicians lined up to denounce the Panthers as extremists. Television anchors spoke in tight voices about order and security. But what they were responding to wasn't violence. It was exposure. Because in one public moment, black citizens had displayed the contradiction the country depended on ignoring. The same constitutional rights praised when exercised by white militias were condemned when exercised by black communities trying to survive. And that contradiction didn't stay theoretical. It became policy. California Governor Ronald Reagan stepped into the story as the clearest proof of what was happening. Reagan, who would later build a national identity around limited government and personal liberty, was at that time known as a strong defender of gun rights. He supported the National Rifle Association and spoke of firearms as part of an American tradition. But when the Panthers appeared armed at the Capitol, his position shifted with stunning speed. He publicly backed the Mulford Act. The bill moved quickly through the legislature with bipartisan momentum. Democrats and Republicans who disagreed on countless issues suddenly found unity. They did not hesitate. They did not stall. They did not demand deeper debate. They rushed. And within weeks, Reagan signed the Mulford Act into law with cameras rolling. Open carry was now illegal in California. A right defended for decades had abruptly become too dangerous once black people used it to protect themselves. That moment exposed something fundamental. The Second Amendment had never operated as an equal guarantee. It functioned like a privilege, extended to those the system trusted, restricted from those it feared, and the state wasn't finished. Disarming the Panthers wasn't enough. The next step was to break them. That's where federal power entered. Under FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, a covert program escalated into a national campaign. Its goal wasn't public safety, it was neutralization. The program was called COINTELPRO, and the Black Panther Party became one of its central targets. This wasn't the normal work of policing, investigating crimes and bringing cases to court. It was war. Agents used informants to penetrate chapters. They planted evidence. They forged letters to create suspicion and fracture trust. They engineered rivalries between black organizations to provoke conflict. They coordinated with local police on raids designed not simply to arrest, but to destroy. Hoover described the Panthers as a major threat to the nation's internal security, not because they had launched an uprising, but because they organized black people, educated them, and proved that communities could defend themselves and still build. And the campaign intensified with speed. What the public saw were raids and arrests reported as law enforcement action. What the public didn't see was the machinery behind it. Federal intelligence shared quietly, operations planned off the books, tactics designed to produce deadly encounters that could be blamed on the Panthers. The objective was simple: discredit the movement, drain its resources, terrify its supporters, and if leaders died, that loss was treated as acceptable. Then came the moment that would become the darkest symbol of this campaign. December 4th, 1969, Chicago. In the early hours before dawn, police raided an apartment where Panthers were sleeping. Inside was Fred Hampton. Only 21 years old, Hampton was already one of the most effective organizers the movement had produced. He wasn't just building local chapters, he was building alliances, linking poor black communities, poor white communities, Latino organizers, street groups, and labor activists into coalitions based on shared economic oppression. That ability, uniting across race and neighborhood lines, terrified the state more than any rifle ever could. An FBI informant had drugged Hampton hours earlier with a powerful sedative. By the time police arrived, he was unconscious. He never truly woke up. Officers opened fire. More than 90 shots were fired by police. The Panthers fired one. Hampton was shot at close range while in bed. Police called it a shootout, but ballistics, testimony, and evidence pointed to something else. The damage was done either way, because the message had already been delivered. Even if you are young, even if you are disciplined, even if you are legal, if you build real power, you will be eliminated. And raids like this did not stay in Chicago. They spread across cities: Los Angeles, Oakland, New York, Philadelphia. Offices were burned. Members were arrested on charges that fell apart but still consumed years. Court battles dragged on, draining time, money, and momentum. Informants fed paranoia from the inside until suspicion became a weapon. By the early 1970s, the Panthers were fighting on every front at once: legal attacks, media smears, engineered internal fractures, constant surveillance, and the ever-present threat of death. And yet, while they were being hunted, they were also doing something the government could not allow the public to remember clearly. They were building a parallel system of care. And that part of the story is where the narrative becomes even more dangerous. While law enforcement agencies worked to dismantle the Panthers, something else was happening at the same time, quietly, consistently, and with growing impact. They were feeding children. Every morning before school, Panther volunteers prepared and served breakfast to kids who would otherwise arrive hungry, not occasionally, not symbolically, systematically. At its height, the program fed tens of thousands of children every single day. This wasn't charity theater. It was infrastructure. Teachers noticed that students who ate could focus. Parents noticed relief. Communities noticed that someone had stepped in where the state had failed. The program worked so well that the federal government eventually copied it. What became the National School Breakfast Program was born directly out of Panther organizing. That detail is rarely taught. The Panthers also built free health clinics. At a time when mainstream medicine ignored illnesses common in black communities, they launched the first widespread testing programs for sickle cell anemia. More than 50,000 people were screened. Lives were saved. Awareness spread. They offered legal aid, political education, transportation for elders, drug rehabilitation programs, community patrols, survival programs designed not to beg the system for reform, but to replace its failures outright. They weren't just carrying weapons. They were building alternatives. And that was the real threat, because the fear was never simply about black men with guns. Armed white groups had existed since before the country was founded. The Ku Klux Klan terrorized black communities for generations with little interference. Armed white militias marched openly, claiming patriotism and freedom. What terrified the system was that the Panthers exposed the lie. They showed that the Constitution was not applied evenly, that rights were conditional, that freedom depended on who you were and whether power trusted you. The Panthers didn't fail. They were defeated. Defeated by a system that could not allow black people to defend themselves, educate themselves, and govern themselves at the same time. And even in defeat, the impact didn't disappear. Because while the organization was dismantled, the ideas refused to die. The tactics used against the Panthers didn't vanish either. They evolved. The surveillance methods perfected against them became standard practice. Infiltration strategies were refined and reused. The language that justified repression was repackaged and normalized. Public safety, law and order, domestic threats. These phrases didn't emerge in a vacuum. They were forged in the campaign against black liberation movements. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, political language shifted again. Leaders stopped openly targeting black radicals and declared new enemies instead: crime, drugs, gangs. But the targets remained largely the same: black neighborhoods, black youth, black communities, mandatory minimum sentences, stop and frisk, 3 strikes laws, militarized policing, mass incarceration, systems described as neutral that produced the same racial outcomes over and over. The infrastructure built to destroy the Panthers became the backbone of the modern carceral state, and the logic never changed. Black self-defense was framed as extremism. Black organization was labeled a threat to democracy. Black competence was treated as danger. The same reasoning that justified disarming the Panthers now justified prisons, surveillance cameras, no-knock raids, and predictive policing. History didn't repeat itself. It continued. And here's the part textbooks rush past. The Black Panther Party existed for just over 15 years. In that time, they were labeled terrorists and enemies of the state, but they never stormed the Capitol to overturn an election. They never lynched anyone. They never bombed churches. They never built power through hatred. They fed the hungry. They healed the sick. They educated the unprotected. They defended people the state refused to protect. And that is why they were annihilated. Because the most dangerous idea in America is not violence. It's independence. It's the realization that oppressed people can organize, protect themselves, and meet their own needs without permission from the system that profits from their suffering. The Panthers proved that black communities didn't need endless reform promises. They needed power, economic power, educational power, defensive power. They showed that survival didn't require assimilation, that liberation didn't require approval. White America did not fear black anger. It feared black competence. It feared discipline. It feared the collapse of the lie that said black people were dependent, disorganized, and incapable of self-governance. And when that lie collapsed, the response was absolute. Erased history is never erased by accident. It's erased because truth is dangerous. And the most dangerous truth of all is this: Black Americans have always known how to save themselves. They've just rarely been allowed to. That denial of black self-determination is the thread that connects this story to the present. Because the Panthers were not an anomaly, they were an answer to a question the United States has never confronted honestly. What happens when the people you've oppressed stop asking for protection and start providing it themselves? From the beginning, this country was built on armed self-defense. White settlers formed militias to protect stolen land. Slave patrols were armed to hunt human beings who fled bondage. Vigilante groups enforced racial hierarchy with guns, ropes, and fire. This violence wasn't treated as chaos. It was treated as order. Weapons in white hands meant stability. Weapons in black hands meant danger. That double standard was never written plainly into the Constitution, but it was enforced relentlessly in practice. Every time black Americans approached parity, the rules shifted. Reconstruction collapsed under armed white terror. Jim Crow was enforced at gunpoint. Civil rights activists were beaten, bombed, and murdered while the state looked away. The Panthers broke that pattern, not by rejecting the Constitution, but by reading it more carefully than their enemies ever had. They understood something many still refuse to accept. Rights that cannot be defended are not rights. They are privileges. And privileges can be revoked the moment they become inconvenient. When the Panthers stood with law books in one hand and rifles in the other, they exposed how fragile America's moral claims really were. They forced the nation to admit that its commitment to freedom had conditions. And once those conditions were exposed, repression followed. Even after the Panthers were dismantled, the lesson lingered. Black movements that followed were watched more closely, regulated more aggressively, criminalized more quickly. Surveillance became normal. Infiltration became routine. Dissent became suspect, especially when it came from black voices. Meanwhile, armed white groups continued to receive the benefit of the doubt. They were framed as misguided, misunderstood, or simply exercising their rights, even when they committed acts of terror. The contrast was not accidental. It was policy. The Panthers forced the country to confront an uncomfortable reality. The Second Amendment had always been enforced through race, and when that enforcement was challenged, the amendment itself wasn't repealed. It was selectively rewritten. That legacy hasn't disappeared. It shows up in every debate about guns that ignores race, every discussion of law and order that strips out history, every portrayal of black resistance as inherently violent while white violence is softened into political expression. The Panthers didn't just reveal a contradiction. They documented it. They put it on camera. They put it in law books. They put it in the streets. And once it was visible, it became dangerous. Because a people who understand the system cannot be controlled by illusion. That is why this story was buried. That is why it was flattened and distorted. Not because it's irrelevant, but because it still is. And because the same fear that drove lawmakers to disarm 30 black citizens in 1967 continues to shape policy today. If this feels uncomfortably familiar, it's because it is. The strategies used against the Black Panther Party didn't vanish with the organization. They became blueprints, and until that history is confronted honestly, the question the Panthers raised remains unresolved. What happens when the people who have been denied protection decide to protect themselves? That question still terrifies power, and that is why the truth they revealed remains unfinished. The danger the Panthers represented was never confined to the 1960s. What they exposed didn't expire when the organization was dismantled. It lingered, adapted, and reshaped how power responded to challenge. After the Panthers, repression didn't disappear. It became quieter. The spectacle of raids gave way to budgets. The shock of assassinations gave way to paperwork. Force was no longer always visible. It became administrative, procedural, normalized. The state learned a lesson from the Panthers. Overt brutality creates resistance. Subtle control creates compliance. So, the machinery evolved. Surveillance expanded under the language of prevention. Databases replaced door kicks. Risk assessments replaced explicit racism. Policies that sounded neutral produced outcomes that were anything but. The goal remained the same: contain autonomy, fragment solidarity, prevent self-determination before it could stabilize. This shift is why so many later movements were watched before they ever made headlines, why organizers were flagged early, why funding streams were scrutinized, why dissent was framed as instability long before it posed any real threat. The Panthers forced power to become more sophisticated, but they also left behind proof that organized black communities could reduce violence without expanding prisons, proof that children could be fed without moralizing poverty, proof that healthcare could exist without profit, proof that safety did not require occupation. That proof was intolerable because it challenged the central myth that authority must flow downward to be legitimate. The Panthers demonstrated the opposite, that legitimacy could rise from the ground up, and ground up legitimacy terrifies systems built on hierarchy. The Panthers didn't just redistribute resources. They redistributed confidence. They taught people that they were not broken, not criminal by nature, not incapable, that the conditions surrounding them were engineered, and what is engineered can be dismantled. That psychological shift was as threatening as any weapon. A community that understands itself as capable is harder to pacify, harder to divide, harder to intimidate, and division has always been one of the most reliable tools of control. COINTELPRO understood this. That's why it focused so heavily on destroying trust, anonymous letters, false accusations, manufactured rivalries, whisper campaigns designed to turn comrades into suspects. The goal wasn't just to remove leaders, it was to fracture belief, because a fractured community cannot govern itself. The Panthers fought this constantly. They emphasized discipline, collective responsibility, political education, structure. They knew repression alone wasn't the greatest threat. Internal collapse under pressure was. Despite everything, they held longer than expected. That endurance mattered. It spoke to how deeply their work resonated and how urgently it was needed. They didn't promise perfection. They promised effort. They asked people to participate, not just protest, to build, not just criticize. That approach is far more dangerous to entrenched power than rage without direction. Rage can burn out. Structure can endure. And endurance is exactly what the system could not allow. The Panthers were never permitted to mature. They weren't allowed to stabilize, to correct mistakes, to evolve beyond early forms. They were cut down mid-experiment because the experiment itself was intolerable. A functioning alternative is the most damning indictment of a failing system. That's why the story of the Black Panther Party cannot be treated as a closed chapter. An experiment that is forcibly ended does not prove failure. It proves threat. Critics often point to internal conflict or strategic errors as justification for what happened, but no movement develops cleanly under constant surveillance, infiltration, arrests, assassinations, and psychological warfare. The real question is not whether the Panthers were perfect. It's why imperfection was treated as justification for annihilation. Plenty of white-led movements survived worse dysfunction without facing coordinated state destruction. Plenty of armed groups were given time, legitimacy, and dialogue. The Panthers were given none of that. They were given force. That disparity reveals how threat is actually defined, not by violence alone, not by illegality alone, but by who challenges control. The Panthers challenged control at every level: physical, political, psychological, symbolic. They challenged who was allowed to feel safe, who was allowed to carry authority, who was allowed to interpret the Constitution in their own defense. They exposed a truth that frightens power more than chaos ever could. Systems don't collapse when oppressed people organize. They collapse when hypocrisy becomes undeniable. The Panthers made hypocrisy visible, and once visible, it could not be explained away. Once people see that laws bend for some and harden for others, legitimacy erodes. Once they see safety distributed selectively, trust evaporates. Once they see that rights are enforced through race, belief in neutrality dies. The Panthers accelerated that realization, and acceleration had to be stopped, not because it was wrong, but because it worked. This is the truth the system has worked hardest to bury. The Black Panther Party did not collapse under the weight of its contradictions. It was crushed because it moved faster than the system could adapt. It forced change through presence, not petitions, through exposure, not appeals. It revealed that the line between order and oppression isn't thin, it's enforced. The Panthers showed that when black people stopped asking for rights and started exercising them, democracy's language shifted instantly. Freedom became danger. Equality became extremism. Self-defense became terrorism. And the speed of that shift mattered. It proved the system didn't need time to decide. It already knew what to do: disarm them, discredit them, destroy them. That response wasn't improvised. It was rehearsed across centuries of suppressing black autonomy, slave patrols, black codes, Jim Crow, surveillance of civil rights leaders, mass incarceration. Each era refined the tools. The objective never changed: prevent self-determination. The Panthers threatened that objective not through chaos, but through practicality. They addressed hunger, violence, illness, and political exclusion at the same time. They understood liberation wasn't a single demand. It was a network of conditions that had to be met together. That understanding stripped away excuses. It removed the ability to blame culture or behavior. It placed responsibility squarely on systems that claim legitimacy while producing suffering. The Panthers didn't need to overthrow the government to expose this. They only needed to operate within the law long enough for the law to betray itself. And it did. Open carry was legal until black people used it for defense. Gun rights were sacred until black citizens exercised them. Limited government mattered until black autonomy threatened control. That is the core of 1967. Not 30 armed black men, but a system exposed. The Black Panther Party existed for just 15 years. In that time, they were surveilled, infiltrated, demonized, and dismantled by the most powerful government on earth. They never carried out mass terror. They never targeted civilians. They never sought domination. They sought survival. They sought dignity. They sought the right to live without fear. And for that, they were treated as an existential threat. That alone demands a reckoning, because it forces a question that has never been answered honestly. What would happen if Black Americans were truly allowed to save themselves? Until that question can be answered without fear, the legacy of the Black Panther Party remains unfinished, and the truth they revealed remains dangerous. That danger never disappeared. It simply went underground, embedded into policy, language, and routine. After the Panthers, repression no longer needed spectacle to function. It learned how to hide behind normalcy. What once required raids and assassinations could now be accomplished through legislation, funding priorities, and quiet bureaucratic decisions that never made headlines but reshaped lives just as effectively. The state did not abandon force, it refined it. Power learned that overt violence draws attention, while procedural control produces compliance without protest. So the emphasis shifted from visible confrontation to managed containment, from breaking down doors to building systems that made resistance unsustainable over time, from punishing actions to preempting them. This shift explains why later Black movements were monitored before they became visible, why organizers were flagged early, why gatherings were infiltrated before momentum formed, why entire communities were categorized as risks long before any crime occurred. The lesson absorbed from the Panthers was clear. Wait too long, and organization becomes difficult to stop. The irony is that this evolution of control only reinforces what the Panthers proved. The system does not respond most aggressively to chaos. It responds to competence, to organization that works, to solutions that make authority look unnecessary. That is why the Panthers remain so uncomfortable to discuss honestly. They disrupt the idea that oppression persists because solutions are unclear. They showed that solutions were possible, practical, and effective when communities controlled them directly. Their existence challenged the belief that inequality was inevitable rather than maintained. And this challenge is precisely why their story is flattened in popular memory. In mainstream culture, the Panthers are often reduced to a single image: men with guns, angry, volatile, dangerous. That image did not emerge organically. It was curated, amplified, and repeated until it crowded out everything else. The breakfast programs faded from memory. The clinics were forgotten. The legal education disappeared. The coalition building was erased. All that remained was the weapon, because a movement framed as violent can be dismissed. A movement framed as criminal can be destroyed. A movement framed as irrational can be erased. This was not accidental storytelling. It was counterinsurgency by narrative. COINTELPRO was not only about raids and informants. It was about perception, about shaping public understanding so repression would feel necessary rather than cruel. Media outlets played their role. Headlines emphasized confrontation over care. Mugshots replaced images of service. Words like militant and extremist became default descriptors, regardless of context. Repetition did the rest, and repetition shapes memory. By the time the Panthers were dismantled, much of the country believed they deserved it. That belief was not built on evidence. It was built on exposure control, and that distorted memory still serves a purpose. Because if the Panthers were reckless radicals, then their destruction feels unfortunate but justified. But if they were disciplined organizers who solved real problems under extreme pressure, then their destruction becomes something far more disturbing. It becomes evidence that effectiveness itself was the crime. That realization threatens the moral authority of the state. It challenges the idea that repression is always reactive rather than preventative. It suggests that power does not wait for chaos. It strikes preemptively against autonomy. The Panthers understood this. They knew that the system would not negotiate with movements that exposed its foundations. They accepted that risk not out of recklessness, but out of necessity. The alternative was submission to policies that promised reform while delivering control. They chose confrontation because survival demanded it. And in choosing confrontation, they revealed the boundaries of American tolerance. They showed that freedom is celebrated until it becomes functional. That legality is respected until it disrupts hierarchy. That rights exist until they are exercised by those the system does not trust. Those boundaries did not vanish with the Panthers. They were reinforced. They appear in how protest is policed, in how surveillance is justified, in how dissent is framed, in how history is taught or omitted. Because a population that understands its own power is difficult to govern through fear. The Panthers understood that political education was as important as physical defense. That is why they held classes. That is why they distributed newspapers. That is why they broke down law in plain language. They didn't want followers. They wanted people who could think critically about the systems shaping their lives. Thinking people are hard to control. That is why repression aimed not just to arrest Panther leaders, but to exhaust them. Endless court cases, financial pressure, smear campaigns, psychological warfare. The goal was deterrence. Make the cost of resistance so high that future movements would hesitate. And for a time, that strategy worked. Black political organization became fragmented. Leadership was isolated. Movements were encouraged to remain symbolic rather than structural. Protest was tolerated as long as it did not produce alternatives. The Panthers violated that unspoken rule. They did not seek inclusion in a failing system. They exposed it and built around it. They demonstrated that legitimacy does not require permission from above. It can rise from the ground up. That idea remains dangerous because once people see that care can exist without coercion, that safety can exist without occupation, that order can exist without domination, the logic of control begins to unravel. The Panthers made that unraveling visible, and visibility changes everything. Once patterns are seen, they cannot be unseen. Once systems are understood, they cannot hide behind rhetoric. Once suffering is recognized as structural rather than personal, demands become non-negotiable. That is why the Panthers were not treated as stakeholders. They were treated as enemies. They did not radicalize black communities. They articulated what those communities were already living. They gave language to experiences long dismissed as isolated incidents or personal failures. They connected police violence to housing policy, health disparities to neglect, poverty to deliberate exclusion. They made the invisible visible, and for that, they were erased. But erasure is never complete. History resurfaces when it becomes inconvenient. It reappears during moments of crisis, when the gap between promises and reality grows too wide to ignore. The questions the Panthers asked are still unresolved. Why does safety always seem to require force without accountability? Why do police budgets grow while schools collapse? Why does self-defense become criminal the moment it is exercised by the wrong people? These are not new questions. They are unfinished ones. The Panthers understood that oppression does not require constant violence. It only requires the credible threat of it. The knowledge that stepping out of line could cost freedom or life. That knowledge shaped everyday behavior in black communities long before the Panthers ever existed. What the Panthers disrupted was not peace. They disrupted fear. By standing openly armed and legally informed, they forced hesitation. They forced reaction. They forced exposure. And when exposure happened, the system responded not with reform, but with control. The Mulford Act was only the beginning. Across the country, laws adjusted quietly. Policing powers expanded. Surveillance authorities widened. Federal agencies gained new justifications, all under the banner of safety. But safety for whom? The Panthers asked that question relentlessly. Safety for communities or safety for power structures dependent on submission? That question was never answered honestly. Instead, the Panthers themselves became the threat. And that inversion of reality may be their most important lesson. When oppressed people resist effectively, defense is reframed as aggression. Survival becomes extremism. Organization becomes conspiracy. This framing is not unique to the Panthers. It is a recurring feature of empire. Enslaved people who fought back. Indigenous nations who defended land. Labor organizers who challenged exploitation. Civil rights leaders who disrupted segregation. The pattern remains consistent. Delegitimize, criminalize, destroy. The Panthers fit squarely into that history. They were not destroyed because they failed. They were destroyed because they succeeded. And that success is the reason their story still refuses to stay buried. What made the Panthers intolerable was not simply that they resisted, but that they made resistance feel normal. They removed the aura of inevitability that power depends on. Once people saw that protection, education, and care could be organized without permission, the idea that suffering was unavoidable began to collapse. And systems built on control cannot survive that realization. This is why the Panthers were never allowed to reach maturity. They were interrupted mid-process, denied the time every movement needs to correct mistakes, stabilize leadership, and deepen its roots. Their experiment was cut short, not because it failed, but because it showed signs of scaling. What worked in one city was clearly transferable to another. That possibility terrified those watching from above. Federal documents later made this explicit. The fear was not individual Panthers. It was continuity. The ability for knowledge to move cleanly from one generation to the next. The ability for organizing skills to spread without fragmentation. The ability for communities to recognize shared conditions across geography and race. That is why the state obsessed over preventing unifying figures, not because of charisma alone, but because clarity spreads faster than confusion. The Panthers translated theory into practice. They took abstract ideas about freedom and made them concrete. Food on plates, medicine in hands, law explained in plain language, safety enforced through presence rather than fear. That practicality removed excuses. It made it impossible to claim that solutions were unclear or unrealistic. It revealed that the barrier was not complexity. It was willingness. This is why later movements inherited both inspiration and caution from the Panthers. They learned what was possible, and they learned the cost of attempting it. Organize, but not too visibly. Educate, but not too broadly. Help communities, but never replace the state. These unspoken limits shaped decades of activism. Protest became symbolic. Change became incremental. Alternatives became suspect. The Panthers rejected those limits. They did not ask how far they were allowed to go. They asked what survival required. That distinction matters because systems designed to manage populations rather than serve them cannot tolerate self-directed survival. It undermines dependency. It challenges legitimacy. It exposes that authority is not natural but enforced. This is why confronting the Panthers honestly remains so difficult. It would require admitting that the violence they responded to was not accidental, that the repression they faced was not excessive, that both were features, not bugs, of a system designed to maintain hierarchy. The Panthers did not invent brutality. They documented it. They did not imagine neglect. They addressed it. They did not create inequality. They confronted it directly. That reframes the entire narrative. They were not extremists disrupting a functional system. They were rational actors responding to a system that was already violent. That distinction changes everything, because once it is accepted, the justification for repression collapses. If the system was already harming people, then resistance becomes logical. If the state was already violating its own laws, then legality loses its moral authority. If protection was absent, then self-defense becomes necessity, not threat. The Panthers forced these contradictions into the open, and once visible, they could not be debated away. The response was therefore not dialogue, but elimination, not reform, but neutralization. That strategy sent a clear message to future generations. Challenge power directly, and the response will be overwhelming. Organize effectively, and the law will be rewritten around you. Build alternatives, and you will be labeled a danger. That message echoed forward, shaping how movements were treated, how dissent was monitored, how resistance was framed. This is why the Panthers cannot be confined to history. The conditions that produced them were never resolved. They were managed, deferred, renamed. Police violence did not disappear. Economic abandonment did not end. Political exclusion did not vanish. They were folded into policies that sounded neutral and outcomes that were framed as unfortunate but inevitable. The Panthers understood this pattern early. They recognized that oppression adapts, that it sheds old language and adopts new justifications, that what was once enforced openly can later be enforced quietly through bureaucracy, data, and distance. Their strategy reflected that understanding. They did not isolate one issue. They attacked the structure. They knew hunger, policing, health, education, and housing were connected. They understood that addressing one while ignoring the others would fail. Liberation, to them, was not a slogan. It was a system that had to function across daily life. That kind of thinking does not expire. It waits. It waits until slogans stop matching reality, until promises feel hollow, until patience runs out. And when that happens, the Panthers stop looking like a relic of chaos. They start looking like a warning that was ignored. This is why their legacy still unsettles people. It exposes the uncomfortable truth that the system which destroyed them still exists in recognizable form. And as long as it does, the questions they raised remain unanswered. The Panthers did not emerge from ideology alone. They emerged from conditions, concrete conditions, police killings, job scarcity, housing neglect, medical abandonment, legal systems that protected authority rather than people. Those conditions did not vanish when the Panthers were dismantled. They were reorganized. When armed patrols were outlawed, policing expanded. When community defense was criminalized, incarceration replaced it. When political education was framed as radicalization, standardized narratives replaced lived experience. The mechanism stayed intact. Only the surface changed. This is why the Panthers still provoke discomfort, not because of what they did, but because of what they reveal. They force a reckoning with the idea that freedom in America has always been conditional, that rights are celebrated in theory but restricted in practice, that legality bends to preserve hierarchy. When the Panthers carried law books alongside rifles, they stripped away plausible deniability. They made it impossible to claim ignorance. They showed that brutality was not the result of misunderstanding, but unwillingness. And once that unwillingness was exposed, the system chose removal over reflection. The destruction of the Panthers delivered a warning that still echoes. Self-defense would be punished even if legal. Autonomy would be crushed even if effective. Independence would be treated as insurrection. The language has evolved, but the intent has not. In later decades, tough on crime replaced anti-radical. Drug wars replaced counterintelligence programs. Militarized policing replaced open repression. But the targets remained disproportionately black. Entire neighborhoods were saturated with force. Economic abandonment was reframed as personal failure. Surveillance became normal. The Panthers predicted this future. They warned that without community control, policing would expand, not retreat. That incarceration would replace segregation. That fear would become policy. They were not speculating. They were observing trajectories already in motion. Today, many systems people accept as inevitable trace directly back to the backlash against black resistance. Expanded police budgets, federal task forces, data collection, informant networks, militarized equipment. The infrastructure of control is everywhere, largely unquestioned, but it all traces back to a moment when black people refused to be passive, when they chose defense over submission, when they proved that rights only matter when they are exercised. The Panthers did not just change gun laws, they changed how power responds to challenge, and that response shaped how America remembers them, or chooses not to. They are remembered as danger because remembering them as competence would force a deeper reckoning. It would require asking why effective solutions were met with annihilation, why autonomy was treated as threat, why survival itself was criminalized. Those questions are still dangerous because they lead to a final realization the system has spent decades trying to suppress. The Panthers were not asking for permission to exist. They were demonstrating that permission was never required. And once people understand that, control becomes fragile. That fragility is the reason this history is still handled with such care, not taught fully, not examined deeply, not allowed to connect cleanly to the present. Because once people recognize how fragile authority becomes when it is exposed, the illusion of inevitability collapses. And without inevitability, obedience weakens. The Panthers revealed something most systems work tirelessly to conceal. Power is not permanent. It is maintained, enforced, defended against challenge. And when that defense fails publicly, the response is not humility. It is escalation. This is why the reaction to the Panthers was not an overreaction. It was a rehearsal. A test run for how the state would respond whenever its authority was challenged not by chaos, but by clarity, not by rage alone, but by organization, discipline, and legal awareness. The Panthers understood that violence was not their primary weapon. Visibility was. They made injustice observable. They documented it. They placed it where denial could not reach. And systems built on inequality cannot survive sustained exposure. That is why reform was never seriously considered. Reform would have required admitting failure. It would have required addressing root causes rather than symptoms. It would have required relinquishing control. Neutralization was easier. The goal was not simply to dismantle the Panthers, it was to control how they would be remembered, to turn them into a cautionary tale, to make future generations hesitate before attempting anything similar. In many ways, that effort succeeded. Ask the average American what they know about the Black Panther Party, and the answer is usually fragmented. Guns, anger, violence, maybe extremism, rarely food programs, almost never health care, even less often political education or coalition building. This ignorance is not accidental, it is curated, because a public that understands why the Panthers emerged might ask questions that threaten legitimacy. Why were police killing black people at such rates? Why were entire neighborhoods left without resources? Why were armed white groups tolerated while armed black groups were annihilated? Those questions destabilize narratives. So the story is simplified, flattened, neutralized. But distortion has limits because memory survives outside textbooks. It survives in classrooms, in documentaries, in oral histories, in families whose children ate because the Panthers fed them, in people whose lives were saved because someone cared when institutions refused. That lived memory refuses to disappear, and it reframes everything. It shows that the Panthers were not extremists inventing problems. They were organizers responding to conditions that were already extreme. They did not disrupt peace. They challenged normalized violence. They did not reject law. They studied it. They did not dismiss the Constitution. They tested it. And when it failed them, the failure was undeniable. This is why the Panthers are still relevant. Not because the same tactics should be copied mechanically, but because the conditions they confronted were never resolved. They were rebranded. Oppression does not need spectacle to function. It only needs consistency, predictable outcomes. A population taught to internalize limits. The Panthers disrupted that consistency by proving those limits were enforced, not natural. They showed that when people stop internalizing restriction, power reacts defensively. It redefines threat. It expands surveillance. It criminalizes organization. It reframes survival as danger. This reframing is still visible today. Every time community self-protection is treated as suspicious. Every time mutual aid is labeled radical. Every time political education is framed as indoctrination. Every time resistance is judged not by harm caused, but by who is involved. These patterns did not emerge spontaneously. They were refined through conflict with movements like the Panthers. The state learned to intervene earlier, to monitor more quietly, to justify repression through language that sounded reasonable. Safety, stability, prevention, risk management, words that obscure impact. The Panthers cut through that language by exposing outcomes: hunger, death, neglect, violence. They refused abstraction. They forced reality into view. And that refusal still matters. Because once people recognize that systems respond more aggressively to competence than to chaos, priorities become clear. Disorder can be managed. Solutions cannot. This is why so much effort has been invested in ensuring that future movements remain fragmented. Why leadership is isolated. Why solidarity across race and class is discouraged. Why narratives emphasize division over shared condition. The Panthers threatened unity. They demonstrated that poor communities, regardless of race, shared material struggles. That exploitation was not cultural, it was structural. That realization undermines the foundations of divide and rule. Fred Hampton understood this clearly. That is why his organizing terrified the state. Not because he was violent, but because he was connecting people who had been trained to see each other as enemies. Unity makes repression harder to justify. That is why unifying figures were targeted, not because they broke laws, but because they broke isolation. They allowed people to see patterns rather than incidents. And once patterns are recognized, reform is no longer enough. Structural change becomes the demand. The Panthers did not demand perfection. They demanded accountability. They did not promise safety without effort. They asked people to participate in building it. That expectation of participation is critical. It shifts people from consumers of politics to agents within it. It removes passivity. And passive populations are easier to govern. The Panthers rejected passivity. They insisted that dignity required action, that rights required defense, that survival required organization. And those principles remain dangerous precisely because they are transferable. They do not belong to a single era. They do not depend on a specific law. They apply wherever power relies on compliance more than consent. This is why the Panthers were treated as an existential threat, not because of what they destroyed, but because of what they made imaginable. A society where safety did not come from occupation, where care did not come with punishment, where education did not require obedience, where communities were capable of governing themselves. That imagination undermines authority more effectively than violence ever could. The Panthers forced the state to confront this possibility, and the state responded with overwhelming force, not to eliminate violence, but to eliminate precedent. Because precedent spreads. If one community can govern itself, others might try. If one group can defend itself legally, others might follow. If one movement can expose hypocrisy successfully, the illusion collapses. The Panthers made that collapse visible. And even though the organization was dismantled, the lesson survived. Power does not fear anger alone. It fears clarity. It fears organization. It fears alternatives that work. That is the through line connecting 1967 to now. Whenever marginalized people organize effectively, the response follows a familiar sequence: ignore, ridicule, label dangerous, dismantle. The Panthers moved through all four stages rapidly. They did not linger long enough to be absorbed or deflected. They forced the issue. And because they forced it, the reaction was swift. Understanding this history does not require romanticizing the Panthers. It requires recognizing what their experience reveals about how systems behave when exposed. They were not unique because they were militant. They were unique because they were effective. And effectiveness in the hands of the oppressed is intolerable to systems built on control. That is why this story remains unfinished, because the conditions that made the Panthers necessary have not been dismantled. They have been managed, deferred, obscured. And as long as those conditions persist, the question the Panthers posed remains unresolved. What happens when people stop asking for protection and start providing it themselves? That question still frightens power, and that fear explains everything that followed. That fear is not abstract. It has shaped policy, policing, and public narrative for decades. It explains why movements that center self-sufficiency are scrutinized more harshly than those that rely on appeals to authority. It explains why calls for reform are tolerated while demonstrations of independence are treated as threats. And it explains why the Panthers, decades later, still provoke anxiety rather than reflection. Because the Panthers did not merely criticize the system, they revealed its operating logic. They showed that control is maintained not only through force, but through managed dependency. Through convincing people that survival requires permission. Once that belief is broken, control weakens. The Panthers broke it. They did not wait for validation. They did not seek legitimacy from institutions that had already failed their communities. They acted as if their lives mattered now, not after legislation caught up. That immediacy disrupted the pace of power. Governments move slowly by design. Communities in crisis cannot afford to. This clash of timelines is crucial. The Panthers operated on urgency. The state operated on delay. Delay diffuses pressure. Urgency forces exposure. The Panthers refused to slow down long enough to be absorbed into endless process. That refusal made them impossible to manage. So, management shifted to containment. What followed the Panthers was not a return to balance, but a tightening. Laws multiplied. Definitions of threat expanded. Entire behaviors were reframed as risks. Surveillance no longer required suspicion. Presence itself became justification. This is how repression modernized. Rather than reacting to actions, the system learned to preempt them, to categorize populations rather than individuals, to intervene before organization could solidify. The Panthers had demonstrated what happened when movements were allowed to grow unchecked. The state resolved not to allow that again. This approach reshaped policing. It reshaped intelligence. It reshaped how dissent was interpreted. Protest became something to manage rather than hear. Community programs became something to regulate rather than support. Self-defense became something to criminalize rather than contextualize. And all of it rested on a single assumption, that autonomy is inherently dangerous. The Panthers disproved that assumption. They showed that autonomy could reduce harm, that communities could stabilize themselves when given tools rather than surveillance. That violence decreased when accountability was enforced from within rather than imposed from above. That is why their example had to be neutralized, not because it caused chaos, because it produced order without permission. This distinction matters. The system is not opposed to order. It is opposed to unapproved order. Order that does not flow through its structures. Order that does not reinforce its authority. The Panthers created parallel legitimacy. They demonstrated that people would trust institutions that served them, regardless of official recognition. That trust is power, and power that does not originate from the state is treated as competition. Competition invites suppression. This is why the Panthers were not debated seriously. Their arguments were not engaged on substance. Their programs were not evaluated on outcomes. They were framed instead as dangerous by default, as if their existence alone constituted a threat. That framing persists. Today, initiatives rooted in mutual aid are often met with suspicion. Community patrols are labeled vigilantism. Political education is framed as indoctrination. Collective self-defense is equated with aggression. These responses are not spontaneous. They are inherited. They reflect a long-standing discomfort with the idea that people might meet their own needs without oversight. That oversight is what maintains hierarchy. Remove it, and the hierarchy becomes visible as artificial. The Panthers forced that visibility. They showed that laws are not neutral tools, but flexible instruments shaped by power. When Black communities used the law effectively, the law changed. When legal protections threatened control, they were redefined. This pattern did not end with the Mulford Act. It became normalized. Voting rights narrowed under the language of integrity. Protest was restricted under the language of order. Surveillance expanded under the language of safety. Each shift framed as reasonable. Each outcome disproportionately affecting the same communities. The Panthers understood that language is one of power's most effective tools. That is why they insisted on clarity. They named what was happening directly. They refused euphemism. They rejected narratives that softened harm. Clarity is destabilizing. It forces choices. It removes the comfort of ambiguity. It demands accountability rather than explanation. This is why the Panthers invested so heavily in political education. They knew that armed defense without understanding could not last. Knowledge was essential. Awareness was protection. They wanted people to recognize patterns, to see connections between policy and consequence, to understand that suffering was not random. That understanding changes behavior. People who see systems clearly stop blaming themselves. They stop internalizing failure. They stop accepting inevitability. And those shifts are difficult to reverse. This is why the Panthers were targeted at the level of thought, not just action. Their newspapers were monitored. Their classes were disrupted. Their messaging was distorted. Control of narrative became as important as control of streets, because whoever controls the story controls the future. The dominant story about the Panthers insists they were a product of their time, that they emerged from chaos and disappeared with it, that modern America has moved beyond the conditions that created them. This framing is convenient. It allows continuity to be denied. It allows unresolved issues to be treated as history rather than present reality. It allows the same strategies to be reused without scrutiny. But the persistence of the Panthers' relevance suggests otherwise. Their story resurfaces whenever communities question why protection feels like occupation, whenever people notice that laws are enforced unevenly, whenever self-defense is treated differently depending on who practices it. These moments trigger recognition. Recognition triggers discomfort. Discomfort triggers backlash. This cycle is familiar because it has been rehearsed. The Panthers were one iteration of it. Not the first, not the last. Their experience offers a lens through which to understand broader patterns. How systems respond when exposed, how legitimacy is defended, how narratives are shaped to justify force. They show that repression often arrives not after violence, but after effectiveness. That the most dangerous movements are not those that disrupt order, but those that demonstrate alternatives. That insight reframes history. It suggests that progress is not resisted because it is radical, but because it is practical, because it threatens to replace rather than reform, because it removes excuses. The Panthers removed excuses. They did not allow the state to hide behind complexity or gradualism. They showed that immediate needs could be met with collective effort. That safety did not require occupation. That dignity did not require permission. That demonstration was intolerable. So the response was comprehensive, legal, political, psychological, narrative, not to correct failures, but to restore control. Understanding this does not require idolizing the Panthers. It requires recognizing what their treatment reveals about power. They were not destroyed because they posed a moral challenge. They were destroyed because they posed a functional one. And that distinction matters now more than ever, because as long as systems continue to rely on managed dependency, any movement that proves independence will be treated as a threat. That is the unfinished legacy of the Black Panther Party. Not a warning against resistance, but a lesson about what happens when resistance works. What makes this legacy so difficult to confront is that it removes comforting explanations. It becomes harder to believe that injustice persists because solutions are too complicated, or because progress simply takes time. The Panthers showed that when communities act decisively, change can happen quickly, and that speed exposed something deeply unsettling. Delay is often a choice. Power depends on delay. Delay absorbs anger. Delay fragments momentum. Delay turns urgency into exhaustion. The Panthers refused delay. They treated hunger as an emergency, not a policy debate. They treated police violence as a crisis, not a talking point. They treated survival as non-negotiable. That refusal disrupted the rhythm of governance. Institutions are built to respond slowly, to dilute pressure through committees, studies, and timelines. The Panthers bypassed that machinery entirely. They acted where they were, with what they had, for the people in front of them. That is why the response to them was not gradual. It was immediate and overwhelming. The system could not afford to let that model normalize. If people learned that solutions did not require permission, legitimacy would erode. This is where the story becomes less about the Panthers themselves and more about what they revealed. They showed that authority is not sustained by consent alone. It is sustained by limiting imagination, by narrowing what people believe is possible. The Panthers expanded that imagination. They made it visible that communities could feed themselves, educate themselves, protect themselves, and care for one another without occupying forces or punitive oversight. They demonstrated that stability could come from solidarity rather than surveillance. That vision challenged the foundational assumption that order must be imposed. Instead, they suggested that order could be cultivated. Cultivation requires trust. Occupation requires fear. The state chose fear, and that choice reshaped everything that followed. It reshaped how protest was interpreted, how neighborhoods were policed, how laws were written, how history was taught. Over time, the methods became less obvious, but no less effective. Control no longer needed dramatic confrontation. It needed normalization. It needed repetition. It needed people to accept that this was simply how things were. The Panthers disrupted that acceptance. They asked people to imagine differently, to imagine safety without intimidation, care without punishment, education without obedience. That imaginative shift is what made them dangerous, because imagination precedes action. If people can imagine a different arrangement, they may begin to build it. And building threatens systems that rely on scarcity, dependency, and division. This is why the Panthers were targeted not only physically, but culturally. Their image was distorted. Their motivations were questioned. Their successes were minimized. Their failures were amplified. The goal was not accuracy. It was containment. Contain the lesson. Contain the possibility. Contain the idea that oppressed people could be agents rather than subjects. That containment has been largely successful. For many, the Panthers exist as a symbol disconnected from substance, an image stripped of context, a warning without explanation. But symbols are unstable. They shift when people look closer. And when people do look closer, a different picture emerges. One that complicates simple narratives about violence and order. One that reveals how often stability is achieved through coercion rather than consent. The Panthers forced that reckoning. They reveal that the line between safety and control is not fixed. It is negotiated through power, and when power feels threatened, definitions change. What was once self-defense becomes aggression. What was once community care becomes subversion. What was once legal becomes intolerable. Those shifts are not driven by principle. They are driven by preservation. Understanding this reframes debates that continue today. It reframes discussions about policing, surveillance, protest, and reform. It raises uncomfortable questions about whose safety is prioritized and at what cost. The Panthers asked those questions openly. They refused to soften them. And in doing so, they exposed how rarely such questions are answered honestly. Because honest answers would require acknowledging that many institutions function exactly as designed. That inequality is not an accident. That neglect is not a failure of imagination, but a tool of governance. The Panthers challenged that design. They did not ask for better overseers. They questioned oversight itself. They did not demand inclusion within broken systems. They built alternatives. That choice matters. It distinguishes reform from transformation. Reform adjusts. Transformation replaces. Power can tolerate adjustment. Replacement is another matter. The Panthers were treated as a threat because they represented replacement, not of government, but of dependency. They replaced fear with participation, silence with education, isolation with solidarity. Those replacements weaken control. And once control weakens, the legitimacy of authority must be defended more aggressively, not through improvement, but through suppression. This pattern repeats because it works. Suppress the most effective examples, distort their memory, allow only diluted versions to survive, encourage resistance that is symbolic rather than structural, celebrate progress without altering foundations. The Panthers refused dilution. They insisted that dignity required more than recognition. It required material change, and that insistence remains disruptive because it suggests that many of the limits people accept are not natural. They are enforced, and what is enforced can be challenged. That realization is dangerous. It encourages people to look at their conditions differently, to ask why certain outcomes persist, to question whether patience is being requested for a reason. The Panthers answered that question with action. They showed that waiting was not neutral. It favored those already in power. It allowed harm to continue uninterrupted. So they acted. And the reaction to their action tells us more about the system than any speech ever could. It tells us that power reacts most harshly when it loses narrative control, when it can no longer claim moral authority without contradiction, when its failures are made visible in practical terms. The Panthers made those failures visible. They did not need to shout. They did not need to persuade through rhetoric alone. They let outcomes speak. Children ate. Violence decreased. Communities stabilized. Those outcomes undermined claims that neglect was unavoidable. And once those claims collapsed, the response became inevitable. Not reform, removal. Understanding this history does not provide easy solutions, but it provides clarity. It shows how systems behave when confronted with effectiveness. It reveals that the most threatening movements are not those that express anger, but those that solve problems. That insight is transferable. It applies wherever people organize to meet their needs without permission, wherever alternatives challenge dependency, wherever competence threatens control. The Panthers were one such moment. Their story remains relevant because the dynamics they exposed are still at work. And as long as those dynamics persist, the question they raise cannot be silenced. What happens when people realize they do not need to wait to survive? That question continues to unsettle power. And that is why the legacy of the Black Panther Party remains unfinished. That unfinished legacy matters because it reveals something most official narratives try to avoid. Systems rarely change because they are persuaded. They change when they are pressured by alternatives that work. The Panthers applied that pressure not through chaos, but through competence. And competence, when it emerges from the margins, forces power to react. This is why the question the Panthers raised never truly went away. It only became harder to ask openly. What happens when people stop accepting vulnerability as their natural state? What happens when they stop believing safety must come from institutions that have consistently failed them? The Panthers answered that question with action, and the reaction to that answer revealed the limits of tolerance built into the system. Those limits are still enforced. They appear whenever communities attempt to organize beyond symbolic protest, whenever mutual aid grows large enough to matter, whenever political education begins connecting dots that power prefers kept separate. The moment effectiveness appears, scrutiny follows, regulation follows, suppression follows. This pattern teaches an important lesson about how power defines danger. Danger is not measured by harm caused, but by control lost. Movements that fail quietly are ignored. Movements that succeed visibly are targeted. The Panthers succeeded visibly. They forced the system to confront itself. They made contradictions public. They demonstrated that neglect was not inevitable, that alternatives were possible, that authority was not the only source of order. Once that demonstration occurred, the response was no longer about law, it was about containment. This is why legality never guaranteed safety. Everything the Panthers did at the beginning was lawful. That did not protect them. Instead, it accelerated the rewriting of law itself. When legality threatens hierarchy, legality changes. That reality challenges one of the most deeply held assumptions about democracy, that rights are fixed, that laws are neutral, that justice is impartial. The Panthers exposed how fragile those assumptions are. They showed that rights function as permissions, not guarantees, that permissions can be revoked, that enforcement reveals who the system trusts and who it fears. That exposure is what makes their story so difficult to integrate honestly, because it forces a reckoning with how power actually operates, not how it describes itself. And that reckoning has implications far beyond the Panthers. It forces questions about modern policing, surveillance, incarceration, and political participation. It raises doubts about whether reforms that leave structures intact can ever produce justice. It challenges the idea that patience is always virtuous. The Panthers were impatient because people were dying. They understood that waiting for gradual improvement meant accepting ongoing harm. They rejected that calculus. They treated life as urgent. Urgency disrupts governance. It collapses timelines. It exposes priorities. The system responded by slowing everything else down, by expanding bureaucracy, by diffusing responsibility, by framing urgency as extremism. That framing still functions today. Urgent demands are labeled unrealistic. Structural critiques are dismissed as divisive. Calls for autonomy are reframed as threats. Meanwhile, the conditions that produced urgency remain. This is why the Panthers continue to resurface in moments of crisis, when trust erodes, when institutions fail visibly, when people begin asking why survival feels conditional. Their story becomes relevant again, not because it offers a blueprint to copy exactly, but because it reveals dynamics that repeat. It shows how power reacts when its authority is challenged not by violence alone, but by effectiveness. It shows how narratives are shaped to justify repression. It shows how memory is curated to discourage imitation, and it shows that erasure is never complete, because lived experience carries truth forward. People remember who fed them, who protected them, who explained their rights, who showed up when systems did not. Those memories resist distortion. They form a counter history that refuses to disappear entirely, no matter how often it is minimized or dismissed. That counter history complicates simple judgments. It makes it harder to accept claims that repression was necessary or unavoidable. It raises doubts about who benefits from stability and who pays its cost. The Panthers force those doubts into the open. They remind us that stability can coexist with suffering. That order can be maintained through neglect. That peace can be defined in ways that exclude entire communities. They challenged those definitions, and for that, they were removed. But removal did not solve the underlying contradictions. It only postponed confrontation. Those contradictions remain embedded in modern systems, in who is policed, in who is surveilled, in whose resistance is criminalized, in whose violence is excused. The Panthers did not create those disparities. They revealed them. That revelation still threatens the legitimacy of institutions that depend on the appearance of neutrality. Because once neutrality is questioned, authority must be justified on different terms, and justification is harder than enforcement. The Panthers forced that shift. They showed that moral authority cannot survive exposure to sustained contradiction. That legitimacy erodes when outcomes consistently betray rhetoric. That erosion is slow but cumulative, and it explains why history like this is handled so cautiously, why it is fragmented, why it is often presented without connective tissue. Because connections invite comparison, and comparison invites accountability. The Panthers invite comparison between then and now, between rhetoric and reality, between what is promised and what is delivered. Those comparisons are uncomfortable. They raise questions that do not have easy answers. Questions about power, consent, and control. Questions about who is allowed to define safety. Questions about whose lives are treated as urgent. The Panthers insisted that Black lives were urgent. They did not wait for recognition. They acted as if dignity was non-negotiable. That insistence remains their most radical contribution, not the weapons, not the uniforms, not the imagery. The refusal to accept delay as neutral, the refusal to accept neglect as natural, the refusal to accept that protection must come from the same forces causing harm. That refusal still resonates because the conditions that produced it have not disappeared. They have been managed, and management is not resolution. As long as communities continue to face violence, neglect, and exclusion, the logic the Panthers articulated will continue to surface. The logic that survival cannot wait, that rights must be exercised to exist, that autonomy is not given, it is built. That logic unsettles power because it shifts responsibility. It moves it from institutions to people, from permission to action, from waiting to doing. The Panthers embodied that shift, and that is why their legacy remains unresolved. Not because history failed to record it, but because the question it raises is still unanswered. What happens when people stop asking the system to save them and begin saving themselves? Until that question can be answered without fear, the story of the Black Panther Party will continue to matter, and the truth they exposed will continue to haunt the structures that tried to bury it.